Hello Internet, I'm Oliver Worley from Ikarus' workshop, and while my lighting may have needed a bit of repairs and whatever, I've got it sorted and I'm not going to let it distract me from what I wanted to do because I am focused and I'm professional. Trust me, believe me, I'm good at what I do. So for this video I did want to take a more specific approach to a lot of my kind of discussions. So I've made a number of videos on topics generally, not really discussing the specific sort of scenarios in which they exist. And while I do bring in context, I'd like to kind of focus down on something. Plus, the title of the game that I'm going to be using is kind of like my groundwork. It's hopefully going to see at least more than 2 or 3 clicks through, because I like as I've said at the end of each of my videos, I really do like big numbers going up. So I'm going to do whatever I can to get that to happen. However, there is a genuine interest in the topic that I'm doing, otherwise I don't reckon I'd be any good at doing it. So, what I'm doing is I'm taking the Kamski test, because that's not a tongue twister at all, and I'm going to be from Detroit Become Human, and I'm going to be breaking it down and saying why I don't think it's a valuable test, or at least it doesn't have the value as it's presented in the game. Self-explanatory here, there are probably going to be spoilers. I might let something slip, so just be cautious. My intention isn't to do that, but I want to get rid of all moral and legal responsibility, so just be cautious. So, as always, when I want to discuss this, let's break it down into context. So the Kamski test is very similar to the Turing test for AI development, in the sense that the Turing test is there to develop whether something is artificially intelligent. It actually has an intelligence of its own. The Kamski test is designed specifically for discerning empathy, and its goal essentially is to, using certain criteria, break down to see if a functionary is empathetic, is an empath, has empathy. If a thing has empathy, and then from that they can determine whether it's got humanity or not. And there goes the God, I'm bad with words today. And there goes the philosophical debate as to whether that thing deserves rights and all that. However, I find a number of flaws in the way it's handled. So let me just propose the situation in which it's presented to you in the game. So you're currently, when this takes place, playing as Connor, an investigator android who is who has a current mission to investigate why a number of androids seem to be disobeying their leaders, despite having a number of priorities in programming and protocol to determine things that they're not allowed to do. They're being violent, they're disobeying, they're running away, that sort of thing, and that's happening, and it's an escalating problem. So you're here as the android to investigate this. You've also got a partner, Hank, and depending on how you've played the game, you might be friends with him, or you might be enemies with him. The point is, Hank is basically the empath of the group. He's very willing to break code and conduct, and basically ignore the parameters and goals of the mission to do what he thinks is right. Okay. You, on the other hand, are a specific android whose sole purpose is to obey its superiors, and in this instance you're being given you've been given to solve this deviant problem. Now, the third character who's important in this is of course Kamski. He was the developer of these androids, and from the android's perspective, you're playing as Connor, the investigative android. From Connor's perspective, he almost assuredly knows what's going on, he almost assuredly knows how to fix it, and yet has made no effort to get in contact. Now, people have reached out to him, but it's only when they've the police and all that actually sent Connor, or you, and your partner to go and meet Kamski does anything actually get done. So that's the kind of context. Now, the actual test is far simpler. Kamski gives you the option, okay? Shoot and in turn terminate the android in front of you, okay? He takes one of his servant androids and forces them onto their knees. He says, shoot that android in front of you, destroy them, kill them, whatever you want to call it, and Kamski will answer one question for you, honestly, truthfully, and generously. if you don't shoot, you will get nothing. He will allow you to walk out, but you will not get anything. So, essentially, the test is, do you shoot to further your mission, or do you not shoot and be empathetic and show empathy by not killing or destroying the android? Okay? It's designed to determine whether whether Connor, the one holding the gun, determines if that android in front of him deserves to die, or is a living being, or if it really doesn't matter and the goal is the mission is the only protocol. On the surface, it seems like a valid strategy, a valid sort of test. But in reality, I've got a number of specific nitpicks, which, like a professional, I wrote it down on a piece of paper that I use for taking orders at the place that I work. The first premise is, okay, it's designed. The main goal of the test is to determine empathy, whether something has empathy or not. Is it willing to shoot the android to achieve its goal? Is it going to show empathy? The problem is, the logical decision can also be the empathetic one, or at least appear to be. Okay, so, many times when you're taking action, logic and empathy are not binary opposites. You're not either logical or empathic. Okay, empathetic. Okay, it's more like two axes which are completely separate. Okay, you can be logical and empathetic, or logical and completely removed. The idea is that they're not mutually exclusive, and so you can have a totally logical, non-empathetic decision appear like an empathetic one, especially when you're dealing with a social situation or where you're very limited in the amount of information that you have. Okay, for example, in the test's perspective, okay, you could use reason and logic, even if it's flawed reasoning and logic. Okay, reasoning and logic anyway. Okay, to determine that actually I shouldn't destroy this android because I do not want to hamper my companion's relationship, and he is more likely to help me achieve my goal than this Kamski guy who I don't know anything about. And while he may know the answers, he's made no active decision to help seek them, and he's deliberately being an inconvenience. And so when you weigh up these two people, you're like, who are you willing to support? Even if it's the intelligent decision to choose and shoot the android, it might there's logic to both decisions by deciding not to shoot the android and instead support Hank. You increase your reputation with him. He is more likely to help you in any future endeavors, and in turn you might be able to achieve the mission without destroying the android. And in many cases, you might need to not have destroyed that android to be able to achieve that end. And yet that was all built in the parameters of, I'm aiming to do my job. There's no empathy there. You weren't looking at the android and thinking, that is a being that deserves to live. You were looking at the android and thinking, I don't think shooting that's going to help, or I actually think shooting that's going to be a detriment to my mission. So essentially it's playing on the limitation of Kamski's mind when he sets up this experiment and this test. Kamski doesn't take into account the context in which Connor's mind might be working, and how to best further and achieve that end. Essentially, it's the deception of empathy. I suppose that's another thing. You could simply deceive and pretend you're being empathetic, and I'm never gonna get it. I'm never going to get it. You could deceive people into thinking that you have empathy, even if you don't, for no other reason than personal gain. It's why you've got to be cautious with altruism and pure goodness, because it can often be misinterpreted. Another thing to consider is sometimes it might be important you might be an empathetic being, but you suppress a specific instance because you believe more harm is going to be caused, especially if you have time to think through a situation. For example, if you were to place a human in the situation of Connor, not an android, someone who genuinely has a morality and an empathy, and then you replace that android that they would otherwise shoot with another human, there are many situations when they believe that maybe shooting that human is a means to an end. It doesn't take into account the ends justify the means for the test at all. If the scenario was changed and it wasn't about deviance, it was about like an illness spreading through humans, okay, and this guy would only ever show you the information if you shot this human in front of you, it might, there's a justification that someone could put forward that, despite being an empathetic human, they are willing to overturn that for the greater good. Okay, now this obviously, the guy still has empathy, and yet to that test they would be perceived as not having it. So the test isn't really good for showing whether someone has empathy or whether someone doesn't have empathy. You know, it's not really helpful in that matter. Another thing to consider is the trustworthiness of the situation you're in. The most important thing about all philosophy is understanding the context in which it's applied. One philosophy might be perfect in a number of situations but fail in another because of some other context that wouldn't usually be applied to the others because it wasn't relevant there. And so you've got to apply this context. Now, this context of Kamski, okay, being kind of a secluded isolationist versus Hank being kind of like your loyal compatriot, it might be worth not just, it might be preferable to seek some other means to the end. Plus you've also got to take into account poor reasoning. Okay, you can be a completely, lack empathy completely and still not shoot the android because you reason through something badly. Yeah, it's still reason. Reason exists. You can have good and bad reasoning. Okay, and bad reasoning could still result in, in a decision that looks like it's got empathy, even if it's purely just built on a poor intelligence or just not really thinking things through thoroughly. It might not be spontaneous. You might actually consider all principles. You might just not have the foresight to be able to see through everything totally. And that's another thing. It doesn't take into account the limitations on the intellect of the individual playing at it. It doesn't take into account how smart they are, how far they can perceive and work out how things run. A lot of people, when a lot of intelligent and moral people will make decisions that a lot of non-intelligent moral people will make, because they will understand that paying or doing a certain service, okay, might actually detriment the world in the long run rather than benefit it, even if the benefit is there in the short term. It's about perceiving the kind of prolonged future, and an empathetic person might even understand that and be able to make a moral decision, with that kind of delayed gratification, as it were. And the point is, this test doesn't really account for a lot of features that would otherwise be important on determining empathy. Now, let's be generous and say it actually doesn't determine whether something has empathy or not. It determines whether something doesn't have empathy. Okay, so if they succeed the test, you don't know if they have empathy or not. Okay, but if they fail the test, as in they shoot the android, you might say, okay, we know that this thing doesn't have empathy. Okay, that might be a decision you could come to, and while I think I've presented my own kind of reasons why I don't think that might be the case, but let's be generous and say it is. Okay, that is still not particularly useful, because the test is there to determine empathy and in turn determine whether something has humanity or not. Deserves rights or responsibilities or should be considered a living being. Now, the problem with that is because the test only focuses on one feature of humanity. Okay, so if they just terminate the android, they might certainly not be classed as human. But if they succeed, it doesn't really further solve that problem to determine whether they are or not. Essentially, empathy doesn't equal humanity. It might be a necessary factor, although when you consider things like psychopaths and sociopaths, you might actually say that that's not a factor because they could still be considered human. But the idea is that while empathy might be a required trait for humanity, is not in itself, okay, the core recipe for humanity. You need other features. And while Kamski decides that he believes this Connor is if he succeeds the test, if he doesn't shoot the android, he believes that Connor is an empathic creature, has empathy. Okay, he then treats it as if it was then treats Connor as if Connor was basically human, essentially. He treats them as if they had total and true humanity, and yet the test only accounts for the empathy element. And I do believe that determining humanity requires a lot more factors than just empathy. Now, that's a bit more of a philosophical debate, developing things into abstraction. But I think it comes to show that the actual test that Kamski developed was not well founded, not well thought through. Admittedly, all of these notes came from YouTube comments, so there might not be a lot of forethought from all of them. And one of those points was like an extrapolation from my point on the guilt video that I've got in the process of making. But the point still remains is the test doesn't really hold a lot of validity to it, and so it's not really. And well, it's interesting because in the narrative it serves well. It serves as a good like test for Connor, okay, but in reality it wouldn't. It wouldn't have that same drama. It wouldn't have that same thing. It's useful for a narrative point, but it doesn't really hold any sort of real bearing if it was to be employed in reality. The Turing test, okay, I don't know anything about, but is generally widely accepted as a good kind of standard for determining whether something actually has intelligence or not, whether something is an AI. But this, I don't think would fit within like the brackets or next to the Turing test. I don't think it would. But yeah, that's my 18-minute video, 18-minute video, which I'm going to cut down quite significantly because I spent 20 seconds trying to figure out what 18 was. So yeah, that's me done. That's hit all those buttons. I'm going to stick a bunch of tags on this video to see how many click-throughs I can get, and all's good. So enjoy yourself, folks, and hail the algorithm. Bye. Awkward teenager sign-off complete. I am good at my job. Really bloody good.